Welcome to Through the Lens of Christ, a podcast designed to have conversation about things that are happening in culture, questions that we may have theologically, and other questions that impact our day in and day out lives. Our desire is to be able to build these conversations and to be able to get us to critically think not just about the events that are happening, but how do we see these events through the lens of Christ. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope it helps you to critically think through issues in our lives.
Good morning. How are you both doing?
Good morning.
Good. We're back together again, talking through another episode where we're going to focus on Acts. We've started chapter 14 last week, and we're in the middle of it this week, and so we're officially halfway through the book of Acts, and we've got a lot to go yet, and we're in the middle of these kind of little accounts that Luke is giving as Paul and Barnabas and others travel town to town, and some of the things that they come up against, and the way the gospel is spreading, but also the way the persecution is apparent, and just some things they're confronted with. So good lessons about the gospel, good lessons about who people really are, good lessons about evangelism. So with all of that, Steve will read. We're in chapter 14, verses 8 to 20.
All right. Now at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe.
So little account again of what happened in this town. Starts with a miracle, and a guy who was lame being given strength in his legs, and then how that presents itself in the gospel. So what stands out to either?
Well, to start off with the miracle itself, I think I listened to probably 3/4 of your sermon. I didn't have time to finish it yesterday, actually, but
That's all you can stomach was 3/4.
all I can say, yeah, it's really, yeah. I had a relatively busy day yesterday, which is why it's very dark outside today, and we're doing this too, is one reason. But yeah, no, that was all fine. The idea, what are the miracles for? What do they do? And I think of that. I think of, like, all of Scripture is to show us who Christ is, and surely those miracles do the same thing. They show us something of Christ's character, and surely we understand them as being a way of authenticating the gospel at certain times, right? All the apostles are traveling to these towns, and then the question is, well, is that something that should be happening now? And is that something that happens today? Is the gospel still being authenticated that way? Is Christ being exposed that way, or expressed in those ways, or through those kind of things that may or may not happen? So, I don't know, that's the first thing that comes into my mind reading the text.
Yeah. Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I think so.
Or a position?
Well, yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of groups of people that would claim miracles today and doing those things. And I think some of them may be genuine and some of them may not be, but also always, if they're not pointing to Christ, if they're pointing to the man performing the miracle, if the man performing the miracle is the one that's elevated, or the congregation or the preaching or whatever that is, I don't know that it's of Christ. If it points back to Christ in some way, then that's the thing. And then I am a skeptic of those things. I see them happening in emotional filled worship services that don't balance truth and emotion in the way we should be 100% truth and 100% emotion involved in a worship service. And I feel that some of those services, maybe most of them, maybe even almost all of them, don't have that right balance, and therefore I'm skeptical of what actually happened.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good answer. I think God, I firmly believe that God can do whatever he wants, whenever he desires to do it. And it will always be about him, and it will always be pointing us to Christ. So I'm not so far as a cessationist where I would say that those things can't happen today. I just think I agree with you. When you look at what does happen and you compare it back to scripture, I mean, you don't see when Paul and Barnabas were there healing this man, you don't see them dancing around, calling all the crowds over, saying, look at what we're about to do. This is going to be amazing. And when he gets up, they don't pat themselves on the back and run around talking about how great they are. And there's not the pageantry that goes along with it. It's just, they saw a guy, they told him to stand up and walk. And then that guy actually went out and talked to people, right? He became the witness of what happened. And yeah, so I think I have as much skepticism as you do about these things. And I do think they distract us. We've talked about it with a lot of other things, but we become drawn to what we believe are the benefits of Christ, right? We're like, hey, I know that these things can happen, so I want to be healed. So therefore I'm attracted to God. And you're like, that isn't the point. And so yeah, I think that's a great point.
There wasn't a line of people behind this man that couldn't walk that they just started healing, nor did Jesus, when he walked down the street, turn everything from black and white to living color and heal every single person, right? It's not like Wizard of Oz. All of a sudden we're in Oz and everything's color. It doesn't happen that way. He didn't do it that way. So apparently something else is going on. And his character is not, is not to snap his fingers and make everyone well. That's apparently not in his will. There's something else at play.
Well, and I think to jump to the end, to maybe where I don't want to spoil the surprise at the end, Steve, since you didn't get all the way there, but assuming that you don't get to the end, I spent some time on that at the end of the message. Because you walk through, Paul says about the kindness of God, right? The common grace that God provides. And then just like a couple of verses later, it says that Paul was stoned, right? Left for dead. Like, how do you marry those 2 points, right? And so we just spent some time talking about this isn't a matter of, and the prosperity gospel has kind of shaped all of our thinkings, right? Like, God is this kind of genie. And as long as my life is good, then God is good. And if my circumstances change, then God is failing in some way, or I just need to behave differently, and then God will do something differently. It's like, well, Paul was standing there evangelizing about the goodness of God, about the kindness of God, and yet he was stoned. Like, what was he doing wrong? How was he failing? How was God punishing him? Right? It's like, I think we have this wrong view. And there's a lot of difficult things that are going to happen in our lives, and there's a lot of difficult some of which we bring on, right? And there's discipline and all those things, and sometimes it's just the fallenness of the world that God is going to use for his benefit and glory. And sometimes that means we're under a pile of rocks and we don't know what to do with it, but we don't get to look at the rocks and say, well, my circumstances define that God isn't really good. And we just have to hold to the one thing that's true, and then start to look at the rest of everything else around that. And often we get centered on what we see as true, and then we start defining God in a different way. And that's a bad place to be.
Yeah. I must have got further than I thought because I got there. So.
Oh, so I was almost done rattling on. You're good.
Yeah. I think it's a huge perspective change too, to even think through that portion of scripture. where like moments ago, Paul is making sure that all of that glory is going to God, that, he's going, this is not me, this is not me. And then he's going, our God is so good, our God is so good. And then he's getting stoned. And he's not turning around from that and going, why did I just waste my time doing that? Why did I just do all of that and put all that effort into that for this to be the result? He still continued to be obedient and continued to speak about the goodness of God and all of that. And I think in our current culture, we don't have that tenacity and that endurance that he had.
Yeah.
So he
I
goes
agree.
off and starts doing the same thing again.
Mm-hmm.
Next
Right.
time.
Right. Yeah. Then goes back into the city, right, where he was stoned. Next day, after being stoned almost to death, everyone thought he was dead. He stands up, God gives him the strength and moves him to the next city. And and again, it's not a like, look, you just gotta be tough, right? The world's hard, be tough, stand up, be strong, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? That's not the message. The message is that God enables us and empowers us and equips us, and we need to keep him central. And so yeah, I think our perspective is definitely jaded and a bit flawed today.
We had there was Faith Foundations class last night at church. The last one was on the Christian life, and we had a little conversation about suffering in the Christian life in the terms of we're fallen people. We have to live a messy life. God saves us, saves some of us, sanctifies us and prepares us for heaven. And the angels never have to do that. So somehow it's in God's will that all these things that are happening on earth, all the stoning of Paul and the much less dramatic difficulties that we go through, but nevertheless, they're difficult. Life is not easy, right? Going through all these things prepares us for what's ahead. So it's for whatever reason, for our good, the Bible tells us, and we trust in that and believe the promises that the Bible has, that even things that aren't pleasant are designed by God for our good. And so that when we get to heaven, for some reason, perhaps because of that, we're actually in a different category than the angels. So angels never experience that. And angels will be ruled over by us. So somehow I think something in the way that God's construed the world and our place in it and all these things that happen to us, it seems to me like it must prepare us for our role as ruling over angels in heaven. Don't know if that's straight out of the Bible, but it just seems to be, there must be something to it, I think.
What Paul says, and I read on Sunday, but in 2 Corinthians 12, right, that he counted all of his sufferings as gain because it caused him to rely on Christ. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that we've learned that we're not sufficient and we need to rely on Christ. So even when we get to heaven through the trial, right, through the fire, that we end up being refined to know that there is a way that points us away from Christ and a way that points us to Christ, and that we've navigated that and been shown that there's greater purposes and there's a greater point. And by the time we get to heaven, I think we'll not that the angels don't have a great appreciation, but that's all they know. We'll have the other side where we're going to appreciate what's there because of the trial and fire that we've been tested through.
We tend to take good things and attribute them to either our wise decision making or maybe somebody else's kindness, not necessarily the Lord's. Or then we also take difficulty and attribute it oftentimes to either our circumstances or to our own stupid decision making, and we beat ourselves up over it. All those things are just worldly answers to standard questions. They have nothing necessarily, I don't know, do they have anything to do with God at all? God has designed all those things for our good, and we're to respond to him through good and bad circumstances.
We end up in some way idolizing all of those things. It's the vanities, it's the no things that Paul was talking about, is that they're all the stones are no things, right? Like all of it is no thing, and all of it is pointing us to the thing. And we miss it. And not that we miss it because, you're an idiot, how'd you miss that? Well, because we're people, right? We're life can be hard, and there are really tragic circumstances, and there are really difficult things. And even if your difficult thing doesn't measure up to Ashley's difficult thing, right? to you, to me, right? My thing is still the worst thing that's ever happened. And so we get so distracted by everything that we're just, I can look at everybody else's life and Steve and Ashley, you should think this way and you shouldn't be distracted by those hard things. And and then I look at my life and I'm like, oh, things are so hard, right? Things are people, if only people knew, right? Woe is me. And we get the know things far, far greater than actually what it's pointing us to. We'd stop early.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And just the whole account of Paul and Barnabas being treated as gods, and their desire to correct that, right? They don't have any background. I shared the background of the story, but they don't have that background, right? They're just there, and there's people running around treating them like gods, and their response is to shut it down. And I think we talked earlier about the healing movement, some of those things, and the pageantry and all that stuff. I mean, Paul and Barnabas could have easily gotten caught up in that. I mean, if on Sunday morning, after the message on Sunday morning, if everybody out front was like, hey, we're going to sacrifice stuff to you because that was the best message that's ever happened, and we're going to have a parade, and we're going to tell everyone how great you are, and like that's really hard. It's easy to say, like, I would never, right? Our pride and ego and arrogance, and that wasn't, I think it was likely easy for Paul and Barnabas, but I'm sure it still wasn't easy for Paul and Barnabas, right? They're like, man, wouldn't that be great? And I just think there's so many people caught up in that today that are focused on, hey, this is how many people are at my church, or this is how many, we need a healing service so we can get the whole town here so that we can have this big thing, and we can have, right? And we're just focused on the wrong things, and our no matter what we say, our ego and pride is a huge part of what sanctification is trying to get us to overcome. And all those things feed into that. And that's why we need strong people around us to make sure that we're not being, brought down a road we don't want to go down.
Yeah, because applause and pride oftentimes aren't quite as subtle as it was in this text.
Right.
When you walk out of church on Sunday morning, you don't have some guy standing on the sidewalk with a lamb ready to sacrifice it for your sake. What they do is they say things, and we interpret things, and we take them inside of ourselves and attribute them in ways that we shouldn't. So way more subtle than what was going on here. In one sense, it was a grace of God that it was a clear line. Right? They're offering sacrifices to these men, and they're like, no. We might not have such a clear line. And all of a sudden we're like moved by it in a negative way in our life. And it's in a much more subtle sense. So so in one sense, the Lord was gracious. He's like, told them what to do, and then they went and stoned them. Well, the Jews came and stirred them up, and then they went and stoned them. I mean, those clear lines are hard lines, but the other thing is, why didn't Paul and Barnabas heal themselves after all this? I mean, why? There's all kinds of healing issues going on here that we could not. I shouldn't go back into that problem. But
but I think it's an interesting text that has a lot of conversation to be had in it. You hate to just brush over it in one message, right? There's so many pieces that we didn't even get to, but I love the point that Paul's laying there dead, and then it just says the disciples just came around him. So then you can't attribute Paul's healing to anyone but God, right? It's like they came around him, likely mourning that he's dead, and probably praying. Like, we don't know what they were doing. They came around him. It doesn't say Barnabas said, hey, I'm going to heal you. It's like, nope, he just miraculously recovers enough to be able to walk back into town. Well, who did that, right? It's the same God that healed the man at the beginning of the story is the same God that's healing Paul at the end of the story, and he'll do what he desires to do.
Yeah, in one sense, maybe this is a help in kind of wrapping it up. But the text mentions, and you mentioned the dedication of these Jews that came to stir the crowd up so they would stone him. I mean, just think of the crazy pandemonium that's happening to these guys in this particular scene. I mean, crazy stuff's going on. It's because the world is insane. I mean, everyone who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ is a crazy person. I mean, there's a holy God standing against them, and against us if we don't believe, right? But for believers, that's resolved through Christ. Christ makes peace in that situation, and we're in a whole different place and looking at the world in a whole different way. They're not. They're struggling. So in one sense, compassion is required, right? These are lost people that are trying to find their way, and they're failing, and they're flailing, and they're throwing rocks, and they're trying to attribute things to the wrong people, causes to the right, the outcomes to the wrong causes, things of that nature. It's a mess. It's a mess. And what has to happen? God sends them on. God says, nope, you're done here. These people, you're going to leave for now, and you're going to go somewhere else. And so what does he do? Many of them are left to their own devices. Some are, I'm sure, are saved, and hopefully they're able to influence the ones that are left.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting as we kind of go back into the text next week and then kind of beyond. Paul and Barnabas eventually go back into these same towns, right? They were out of these towns, stoned out of the town, and then they come back for the purpose of checking in on all the people they left, right? There's people there who came to know Christ. Can you imagine, like, you're sitting there, you watch an amazing healing, right? You're like, I want to hear this message. If they deliver this message and you're like, oh, wow, this is something way different than I've ever heard before. You consume the message. You watch the guy that gives the message get stoned. You're like, what is happening, right? And then you retain, by God's grace, you retain that message. And you go, but I do believe this, but I don't know what to do with that now, right? Like, I just, like, I mean, I can't imagine trying to process. Most of our stories are that you were somewhere safe or by yourself or with family when you heard about Christ and you believed, and somebody's there to kind of help you a little bit, right? And maybe there was some discipleship, or you probably didn't watch somebody get stoned right after you were like, I believe, right? I mean,
Pandemonium.
Just completely insane. Yeah, I agree. And then trying to make sense of that. And then, but Paul and Barnabas caring enough to say, we need to go back and check on them, because can you imagine what they saw and what they felt and where they're at? And so we're going to risk ourselves to go back because we care.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right. Well, this is all good. There's so much in the text that we could continue to talk about, but I think overarching point is that God's kindness is there always. Our circumstances will constantly change, but we need to make sure that we're seeing not all the things of our circumstances, whether good or bad, but actually the one who stands above all of those things, and be pointed to Christ in everything. So it's good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.